Welcome to the Workflow Podcast. If you enjoy this show, please like, share, and/or subscribe. And now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome back to the Workflow Podcast for lucky episode 5. I was going to say 4. That was 5 of the Workflow Podcast of Season 3, which is all about personal productivity. And today we're going to get into the E in TIRES, which is the path of least effort. That's where the E comes from. And today we'll be talking about how we are predisposed to taking the path of least effort with whatever it is we're pursuing. Now, why is that? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, if you go back in time for tens of thousands of years, well, let's take even a further step back. The world's been spinning for about 4 billion years. Homo sapiens, in our current form, we've been here for about 250,000 years. Now, 240,000 of those years, we were essentially hunter-gatherers. It was only about 10,000 years ago that somebody somewhere picked up a plow, and that essentially paved the way for the first agricultural revolution, and that meant that we started to establish permanent places of abode. We started to develop communities, and slowly thereafter, towns started to evolve, language, and eventually the second industrial and agricultural revolution about 10,000 years later, or 250 to 300 years ago, really changed the way we do everything. But for the majority of our existence as a species, we were hunter-gatherers. And when we were hunter-gatherers, we didn't know when we would eat. We could go days without eating. And effectively, our brain learned to conserve energy for moments of fight or flight, for moments of evading predators, for moments of pursuing prey. And effectively, during that time, it was all about fighting, fleeing, freezing, or fornicating. The 4 F's that pretty much sums up our existence. And of course, sleeping. But I can't think of a word that starts with F to represent sleeping. Nonetheless. And the thing is, it's only been 10,000 years since our way of life started to shift. So most of these built-in dispositions, most of these built-in biases and ways we react to things, our fight or flight mechanisms, the parts of our brain such as the amygdala and the limbic system, which are associated with our primitive sort of evolutionary and survival instincts, they're all still there. And so when we're sitting down to our work, initially we're going to want to pick the lowest hanging fruit because that helps us to conserve energy for moments of fight or flight. So we're essentially fighting with evolution in some respects when we're sitting down and when we're trying to get into that space of flow or deep work. It requires us to really override our physiology in some way. Fortunately, though, there are some things you can do to get beyond that wiring and to do your best work. And we're going to channel one of the great thinkers, one of the great physicists of all time today, Sir Isaac Newton, who of course came up with the original theory for gravitational forces, which was of course updated by Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity a couple of hundred years later. But back to Isaac Newton, he published essentially his famous 3 laws of motion back in 1687. Now, we're going to get into these 3 laws of motion today and talk through how these laws of motion apply to you doing your best work. Now, the first law of motion essentially suggests that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion. Now, this is going to be true of both of them, that they will stay in rest or they will stay in motion until they meet an unbalanced force. So if I am rolling a ball down a hill, now that ball is going to keep rolling until it meets an unbalanced force, and that unbalanced force could be the resistance it meets by way of, say, gravity, by air, by wind, whatever the case is, but it could just be that hill tapers off and On the other side of that hill, there is a flat section, and then there is a section that's a bit of an incline, and eventually the ball comes to a rest. Now, the classic thought experiment, if you want to call it that, on this is about a book on a table. So picture a book on a table. Now, there are two unbalanced forces acting upon it. There's the downwards pull of gravity, pushing the book down onto the table, but also the upwards push of the table. Now, these forces are essentially of equal magnitude, so they balance each other out, and the book stays on the table. It doesn't move anywhere. So that was the first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion until it encounters an unbalanced force. Now, the second law of motion that Isaac Newton penned is that the rate of change of momentum on a body is directly proportional to the force applied and the direction of the force applied. Now, this is known as that classic equation F equals ma, or force equals mass times acceleration. So mass being the weight and size of an object, acceleration being the rate of change in velocity, and velocity equaling distance over time. Now, if you want to move that book on the table, you of course need to apply some force. You apply that force to the left side of the book, it's going to move to the right. Now, of course, if you remove that force, then the book is not going to go anywhere. Now, on the other side of that, there are forces that slow down the rate at which that book moves across the table. So those forces, or contact forces, could be things like applied force, so someone pushing from the other side. There could be, say, air resistance force. There's some form of drag in the air. There could be frictional force, which is force exerted upon an object by a surface. So if that book is being pushed across, say, a very rigid, rough surface, then it's not going to roll. It's not going to slide as smoothly as it might if that was, say, a lubricated marble table surface. There are other forces you want to contend with, which are, say, gravitational forces, pulling down on gravity, pulling down on objects, electrical forces, and magnetic forces. And finally, the third law of motion. And don't worry, this is all going to come together and make sense in terms of what this has to do with you getting your best work done and beating procrastination. But the third law of motion is essentially posits that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So how might we apply, say, acceleration, velocity, mass, friction, the laws of motion, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, and so on to our professional and personal lives? Well, let's look at some of these factors individually and see how they might be interpreted when it comes to our work. Firstly, velocity, the average speed at which you are moving towards your goal. Acceleration, the rate at which your velocity is changing. Time, how long we've been doing something. Now, there are forms of friction that can get in the way. So whether that's cost friction, skill friction, people friction, policies and processes friction, time friction, switching cost friction, lack of social capital friction. So many different things can get in our way when it comes to doing our best work. Knowledge friction is another key one as well. So if you want to get further faster when it comes to your work, well, it makes sense to remove friction. So if I'm trying to create sales, but I keep hearing the word no, well, I should ask why people are saying no. What are their exact objections? And it could be price, it could be lack of social proof, it could be that we're not offering something that other providers are offering. And we can use that information to remove that friction. And the next time we have said conversation, we're much more likely to get that book to the other side of the table and get that sale. But where I really want to go with this is momentum. So momentum essentially equals mass times velocity. So this all comes down to getting started. So for example, if I'm struggling to get started with a piece of work, just committing to the smallest possible unit is going to help me get to where I need to get to. If I'm looking at a blank canvas and I need to write down 1,000 words, well, just committing to writing down 50 words is going to create some momentum. It's going to make it so much easier for me to keep going than it would be if I was just sitting there staring at the blank page. As Isaac Newton said, an object in motion stays in motion. This can apply to work, but it can also apply to anything else. Like if I'm sitting on the couch night after night watching Netflix, but I really should be reading some books, just commit to reading one page, and you'll find that it's so much easier to read the rest of the chapter. Going to the gym, commit to going for 5 minutes, and you'll find that it's so much easier to do a whole, say, 30 or 40-minute workout. Just take the smallest possible step, and that's going to create momentum. One thing that Ben Mesrick, author of books that were turned into box office smashes like 21 and The Social Network, he likes to finish writing in the middle of a sentence so that the next day he just finishes that sentence and he is already writing. He's already in flow. So the law of momentum is a really powerful one that can help you beat our evolutionary wiring to take the path of least effort. Now, I've got a whole bunch more on this on the steveglaveski.com website. It's also on the Collective Campus website. The article is called How to Reach Your Goals Faster with Isaac Newton's Laws of Motion. But there you have it. In order to overcome 240,000 years of evolutionary programming, predisposing us to picking the low-hanging fruit only and not doing any difficult work, just start with the smallest possible unit of work, and you'll find that it is so much easier to keep going, and at that point, so much more difficult to stop. With that, this episode of the Workflow Podcast is being brought to a close. Wishing you an amazing rest of your day.